Someone in your group just died. No hospital, no funeral home, no priest, no police, no number to call. Just a body on the ground and everyone staring at it. What do you do? Bury it? Burn it? Leave it? Paint it red? Keep the skull? Or do something so disturbing that thousands of years later, archaeologists would still struggle to explain it? Because for prehistoric humans, death was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of a ritual. And some of those rituals were stranger, darker, and more emotional than anything we imagined. The first thing they probably did was nothing. They stayed. They looked at the body. They waited. Because before graves, before coffins, before cemeteries, there was this moment. Someone who had been warm was now cold. Someone who had moved was now still. Someone who had answered was silent. And somewhere deep in human history, something changed. The dead were no longer treated like ordinary remains. A dead animal could be dragged away, but a dead person was placed. That difference matters, because placement means choice. Choice means attention. And attention means the body was no longer just a body. It meant something. Neanderthal burials remain debated in some cases, but sites like La Chapelle-aux-Saints are often cited as strong evidence that Neanderthals intentionally placed and covered their dead. They dug, they positioned, they covered. That takes effort, and effort means intention. A burial is not just a hole in the ground. It is a decision. It says, this one matters. But burial was only the first answer, because in some graves, before the dead disappeared into the earth, they were covered in the color of life. Before some bodies were buried, they were painted red. Red ochre, a mineral pigment crushed into powder. It was placed on bones, on skin, inside graves, around the body. And nobody knows exactly why. That is the important part. We do not know. But when you see red powder on the dead, the possibility is hard to ignore. Red looks like blood, and blood means warmth, movement, breath, life. So maybe this was not decoration. Maybe it was a final attempt to return color to someone who had gone pale. Maybe it was a way of saying, you are dead, but you are not empty. You are gone, but not erased. And once you understand that, graves stop looking like bodies were hidden. They start looking like places where the living tried to speak. Then they were not place. This possibility, looking for this contact and red. We may be breg there is sung here. Around 34,000 years ago, in what is now Russia, two children were buried together, head to head, covered in red ochre, surrounded by ivory spears, ornaments, and thousands of tiny beads. The Sungir burials are famous for their elaborate grave goods, including red ochre and thousands of ivory beads. Not 10 beads, not 100, thousands. Each one carved by hand. Imagine making one, cutting it, shaping it, piercing it, polishing it. Now imagine making another, and another, and another. For children who would never wear them while running, never trade them, never grow into them. Some estimates suggest the beadwork required thousands of hours of labor, possibly more than 10,000. Think about that. These people lived in the Ice Age. They hunted mammoths. They faced cold, hunger, injury, darkness, and danger every single day. Every hour mattered. Every calorie mattered. Every piece of ivory mattered. And still, they spent an almost impossible amount of time preparing gifts for two dead children. That is no purpose. That is the change of the two away. They spent an almost impossible amount of time preparing gifts for two dead children. That is the spent, the change of dead children. That is the community invention into the dregs of the computer. That is not preparing gifts for two dead children requiredly and be all two. That is the change of gifts for two dead children. That is the purpose counterlaid for two dead children spent an almost impossible amount of time preparing gifts for two dead children. That is grief made visible. But grief did not always look gentle. Sometimes, before something entered the grave, it had to be destroyed. Some prehistoric graves contained tools, blades, weapons, useful objects. But sometimes those objects were broken, not worn down, not damaged by time, broken before burial. A blade split, a weapon destroyed, an object made useless. Why? Why take something valuable, something that took skill, time, and material to create, and break it before placing it beside the dead? One possibility is that the object had to cross a boundary too. Maybe the tool could not go with the dead while still belonging to the living. Maybe it had to be changed, ended, released. In other words, maybe the tool had to die. And that changes everything. Because suddenly a tool is not just a tool. It has a life, a purpose, maybe even a spirit. And if the person had crossed into another world, perhaps their possessions had to cross with them. But sometimes the living did the opposite. They did not send everything away. Sometimes they kept part of the dead behind. The part we recognize most easily, the face. In some prehistoric sites, the skull was separated from the rest of the body, not by animals, not by accident, by people, carefully, deliberately. And then it was kept inside the camp, near the living. To us, that feels disturbing. But maybe to them, it was the opposite. Maybe the skull was not a trophy. Maybe it was a presence. Because when the body disappears, the skull remains strangely personal. The shape of the face, the empty eyes, the part of the person everyone once recognized. A person could vanish, but the face stayed. And that tells us something important. Prehistoric people may not have drawn the same hard line we draw between the living and the dead. The dead could remain in the home, in the camp, in the group. Not fully alive, but not fully gone. And then, in one cave in England, that closeness became something almost impossible to process. Because there, the dead were not only remembered, they were consumed. Gove's Cave, Somerset, England. Around 14,700 years ago. Inside that cave, humans did something that still feels shocking today. They ate the dead. The bones show cut marks, flesh removed, bodies disarticulated, bones cracked open, marrow extracted, human tooth marks. That part is not guesswork. Research on Gove's Cave identifies clear evidence of defleshing, disarticulation, chewing, bone crushing, marrow extraction, and human tooth marks. At first, it sounds like hunger, desperation, survival at any cost. But then, archaeologists found something else. Some skulls had been shaped into cups. The edges were worked. The bone was smoothed. The skull became a vessel. And that changes the question. Because if this was only hunger, why shape the skull? Why work the edges? Why transform a head into an object? Natural History Museum researchers describe Gove's Cave as evidence of sophisticated processing of human remains and argue that the behavior was likely ritual rather than simple starvation. To us, it sounds like horror. But maybe to them, it was sacred. Maybe consuming the dead meant carrying them inside you. Maybe drinking from the skull meant staying connected to the person who was gone. Maybe this was not desecration. Maybe it was intimacy. A kind of closeness we no longer understand. And that is what makes it so unsettling. Because the question is not, were they monsters? The question is, what did love look like before our world existed? But prehistoric death rituals were not always tender. Sometimes the living seemed afraid that the dead might not stay where they were placed. Some bodies were buried under heavy stones, not only to mark the grave, maybe to keep it closed. Some bodies were tightly folded, some appear bound, legs forced in, arms restricted, as if the dead were not sleeping, as if they were being restrained. And maybe that fear makes sense. Imagine living in a world with no science of decomposition, no medical explanation, no clear border between body, spirit, dream, memory, and fear. The dead person might return in dreams. Their voice might echo in your mind. Their body might change in ways nobody understood. A body was someone you loved, but it was also something changing, something cold, something silent, something that looked human, but no longer answered. So the living had a problem. They had a problem with majority relations. They covered on the changes. A trouble living had a problem. They went back to anything bloops something. So the people, they didn't know with point one. So the living had a problem. So the living had a problem. They tried hit their ways to one of the problem most dead. But they also wanted to survive them. They wanted them close, but not too close. And yet, when children died, some communities made the opposite choice. They did not push the dead away. They brought them home. In some prehistoric and early settled communities, children were buried beneath the floor, inside the home, under the place where people slept, ate, worked, and lived. Think about that. Every morning, the family woke above the child. Every meal happened above the child. Every night, they slept in the same space. Not because they had forgotten, because they refused to let distance become part of death. The child was not placed far away, not hidden beyond the settlement, not sent to the edge of the world. The child was still home. A grave under the floor is not only a burial. It is a refusal. A refusal to let death remove someone completely from daily life. The living continued above, the dead remained below. And the house became both shelter and memory. But then there is one discovery that pushes the question even further. Because what if burial rituals did not begin with Homo sapiens? What if the urge to carry the dead into darkness is older than us? Deep inside the Rising Star cave system in South Africa, researchers found remains of Homo naledi, a small-brained human relative, not modern human, not Neanderthal, something else. The remains were not found near the entrance. They were deep inside, in darkness, in a place difficult to reach. Researchers have argued that some Homo naledi bodies may have been deliberately placed there hundreds of thousands of years ago. But this claim is controversial, and several scientists argue that the evidence does not yet prove deliberate burial. And that uncertainty matters, because archaeology is not about what we want to believe, it is about what the evidence can carry. But even the possibility is haunting. A small-brained human relative, a body, a cave, darkness, and maybe a ritual. This would be the Poblif believe, which possibly get averate the person, but for this moment, that it is not be a good body. But even a pacifically, which is not prove that we didn't want prevent up with a university. And forget the prove the possibility, this is lit a release that never professed and limited content, but the next general relief. If Homo naledi really placed its dead there, then something we thought belonged to us maybe much older than us. Not born with cities, not born with writing, not born with organized religion, maybe not even born with Homo sapiens. Maybe the first funeral began with another kind of human, carrying a body into the dark. But the deepest evidence of prehistoric humanity may not be a grave, or a skull, or a cave. It may be something simpler. Care. Because long before people buried the dead, they had to decide whether to protect the living. We like to think grief is modern, that it came with language, with civilization, with poetry, with religion. But then there is Shanidar. One Neanderthal from Shanidar Cave had severe injuries affecting his arm, vision, and hearing. And yet, he survived for years. Not days, not weeks, years. Someone fed him. Someone helped him move. Someone protected him when he could not protect himself. Someone chose not to leave him behind. And when he died, what do you think they felt? We do not have a Neanderthal word for grief. We do not have their songs, their prayers, their stories. We do not know what they believed happened after death. But we have the bones, and the bones say something simple. They did not abandon him. Whatever they felt, it looked a lot like love. And maybe that is the real story. But maybe not that prehistoric humans were obsessed with death, but that they were already trying to answer the same impossible question we still ask today. When someone is gone, where do we put the love that remains? We used to imagine prehistoric humans as creatures too busy surviving to think about death. But the evidence says something else. They buried the dead, painted them red, broke objects for them, kept their skulls, feared them, carried them, fed them, and sometimes consumed them. Not because they were primitive, because they were human. Death forced them to invent gestures. A grave, a bead, a skull, a body under the house, a fire in the dark, a tool broken in two. Each one was an answer to the same impossible question. Where did they go? And maybe every ritual was saying the same thing. You are gone, but you still matter. The promise was under where the question is.